7th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. My name is Jennifer Anju Grossman. My friends call me Jag. I'm the CEO of the Atlas Society. We are the leading nonprofit organization introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in fun, creative ways, such as animated videos, graphic novels, and living history events. Today, we are joined by Dr. Naomi Wolf. Before I then get into introducing Dr. Wolf, I want to remind all of you who are watching us on Zoom, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, please use the comment section to type in your questions. If you keep them short, we'll be able to get to as many of them as possible. Dr. Naomi Wolf is a New York Times best-selling author, columnist, and political activist. She received her doctorate in the English language and literature from Oxford University. She's taught at George Washington University and Stony Brook University. Following the publication of her first book, The Beauty Myth, Dr. Wolf became a leading advocate of what's described as third wave feminism. She served as an advisor to the presidential campaigns of Bill Clinton and Al Gore. She has published 10 books, including The End of America, My Letter of Warning to a Young Patriot, and one of my favorites, Outrages, Sex Censorship and the Criminalization of Love. Of course, most recently, she's become a fierce and consistent critic of COVID lockdowns and mandates with personal experience in the censorship of such criticism, resulting in her being deplatformed by Twitter in June of last year. Dr. Wolf, welcome again. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real honor.
So your work and scholarship has covered so many different areas, from feminism to reproductive rights to surveillance concerns and freedom of speech. We could do an entire interview on each subject, but to start with the topical, as mentioned, you've become perhaps the leading critic of lockdowns and of mandates. How did your concern, it's, you know, now that I've read some of your more recent books, I can see the connections, but maybe if you would share with our viewers, when did this concern, begin, and what has been the reception to your criticism?
Thank you. So I do see a through line, of course. I know I'll say this. For all of my books and all these concerns, the core is basic human liberty, basic human rights. I mean, in my view, feminism is nothing more than, the gender prism on basic human rights. And the book I wrote in 2008 called The End of America, which I think you mentioned, it was the first kind of call to alarm that I issued when I saw the degradation of democracy in our country. And I studied other moments in history, other times and places when a free society was under attack. And I found that there were 10 things that totalitarian rulers always did, or would be totalitarian rulers, whether they were on the left or the right, they always took the same 10 steps. So I kind of laid that out on a map. And unfortunately, the last 12 years have seen us moving, and it is nonpartisan, I want to stress, moving, Bush advanced it, Obama advanced it, Trump advanced it, although not as much as people think, to his, credit. I can't believe I'm saying that, and now we're hurtling under an administration that I voted for, not just toward the abyss, but I've been starting to say we're over the abyss. The coup has happened in many ways. And one of the things I point out in The End of America is that people have a misconception about how democracies topple. They've seen a lot of movies. They think it's like, columns goose stepping in the streets or Tiananmen Square. But most free societies that fell gradually and incrementally, and So now we've got all around us, some states that are sort of under emergency law. Actually, 47 states are under emergency law, believe it or not, but some states where you can't. I just had an email from someone saying in Eugene, Oregon, there were security police in a farmer's market to make sure you were wearing your mask properly, right? Some states where citizens literally cannot breathe the way they want to. In other states like Florida, they're still kind of a constitutional republic as we remember it from before 2020. So that's the through line. Every one of these books has talked about personal liberty and human rights. I guess the thing that astonishes me about this particular assault, I'm not just going to say assault because it's over, right? This murder of human rights. I mean, it's over. It's not like that's the end of the battle, but, the coup has taken place, as I've said. What amazes me is that as a feminist, I can't believe how many people on my side of the aisle, my tribe, people I've been around my whole life who are so consistent. And I'm talking about the elite left, obviously, right? Who are so consistent on equality for, marriage equality, LGBTQ rights, racial equality, so right on about, organic food, so aware of how big pharma can be bad when it comes to, silicone breast implants or, hysterectomies that are unnecessary or, the wrong dose of hormones and birth control pills. So many sophisticated people are lining up to create a discrimination society that is pretty much exactly like other discrimination societies that they boycotted in their college years in South Africa or other places. It's so much like Jim Crow laws, so much like being a Jew in Vichy France, like France, I'm so sorry. There's like no distinction. And so I guess that's a long way of saying the through line is human liberty. And I'm kind of shocked. I feel like I haven't changed. I've been saying the same things absolutely consistently for 35 years, really, since I wrote my first book. And I'm kind of astonished that the people I'm talking to these days are, the Atlas Society. I thought Ayn Rand was evil. Conservatives, libertarians. I'm on Fox News. This is not like, I respect it and I love it. And I'm glad to talk to whoever will talk to me about freedom. But I'm astonished to be standing in exactly the same place as the world has changed around me.
Well, we're always looking for silver linings. And if there is a silver lining in all of this, if we could get the great feminist scholar and critic, Dr. Naomi Wolf, to give Ayn Rand another look as a possible feminist icon deserving of respect for breaking a whole bunch of norms and celebrating strong, sexually liberated women and female businesswomen in her novels, then that will be at least something to be thankful for.
I'll have to do that now, right? There's no question.
And I can assist. So it is curious. I mean, because I think that I don't want to get too off the beaten path here, but when you look at some things that cause mania, that cause like a seemingly exaggerated response, and Ayn Rand is one of them. And as a Jewish refugee who came to America with nothing and made something of herself, how it's become that she's like a lightning rod, particularly for the left. But anyway, for another discussion. But digging into that, pointing out that through line in your work, finding yourself, surprised to be talking among, the Jeffrey Tuckers and other libertarians of the world. You are a lifelong Democrat. I was a Democrat until I went to college, actually. You've been an advisor to 2 Democratic presidential candidates. Why do you think that, your friends and your allies and your colleagues or former colleagues, and looking now at Democratic governors who have opted for some of these most severe, aggressive, punishing lockdowns and mandates, is it just politics? If it had been the other side, if Trump had been for lockdowns, would Democrats have been for more, freedom? Or is there maybe something deeper in the underlying principles of the two major parties that have led to different stances when it comes to these non-pharmaceutical interventions?
Great question. Just to note, I didn't advise two presidential candidates. I advised one presidential candidate and one campaign.
Okay.
So I was not an advisor to President Clinton directly. Okay, so globally, right? May I say JAG? Is that what I can call you?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Globally, it is not a partisan issue, and people have to see that. There's a meta nation state script, and more of it is being revealed. A year ago, that sounded like a conspiracy theory, but it's kind of fully documented, and we've been tracking the relationships that are operating really above the level of nation states. So you see that Boris Johnson is locking everyone down and suppressing liberties in the cradle of liberty, the United Kingdom, one of the cradles of liberty. You see in France, Macron, who's a centrist, allegedly, he's saying, my job is to, infuriate, I'll use that euphemism, the unvaccinated to the end, whatever that means, quite terrifying. And if you're not vaccinated, you can't get on a long distance train in France. In Italy, there are severe lockdowns. In Austria, Angela Merkel wasn't, she's not, in alignment with left or right in the United States. In Canada, they are creating they're creating detention centers in Canada. People are saying that leaders are saying unvaccinated people shouldn't get health care. You see this madness in country after country, in spite of what is nominally the party politics, the ideology. And the heartbreaking thing, so many people I'm kind of in alignment with these days, for my whole adult life, I was told were just beyond heinous. What you're seeing in country after country is people like Philippot in France or Nigel Farage in Britain. Populists are the only ones nationalist populists are the ones saying this is not okay. People you'd think would be standing up for human liberty are silent, and it's down to these grassroots populists. People like Steve Bannon. I'm talking to Steve Bannon every week. I thought I don't agree with him on a lot of policy outcomes, a lot, right? But bizarrely, or maybe transcendentally, there's this kind of Venn diagram happening around the world, which is shaking out what we thought were the labels that mattered and leaving only, do you want liberty, or are you okay with serfdom? Or are you supporting serfdom? So I just wanted to say that. That said, in the United States, there is a very, very horrific situation. I don't think we're going to be out of the woods if the Democrats get, upended in the midterms. I'm not a Republican. I'm an independent at this point. But the same thing could happen to Republicans that has happened to Democrats. And I'll get to that in a minute. But right now in the United States, it is true, and we've, again, mapped this data, that there is a really unholy 360-degree alliance between the Democratic Party, the DNC, and big tech money, and China. And so, and a lot of this money is flowing into nonprofits. And this is kind of a loophole that hasn't really been examined or identified. And from the nonprofits, it's flowing to boards of health, it's flowing to school boards, and it's flowing to governors and elected officials. And these nonprofits have very benign sounding names like, CSTE, the, Commission for State and Territorial Epidemiologists. It's a nonprofit that's managing CDC data to serve the agenda of the Biden administration, which is serving the agenda of, Microsoft and big tech and intellectual ventures, which is kind of Silicon Valley kind of stranglehold of investment in technology. You've got Google harvesting COVID test login data. You've got Amazon and Microsoft owning the management of the COVID dashboards, which I run a tech company. This has been driving me crazy. All those dashboards that all this policy is based on that are scaring everyone to death. They're on the front page of the New York Times. No one gets to see that raw data. And when I had leaked to me the raw data for the Johns Hopkins dashboard, which everyone is referencing, and which is funded by Bloomberg, who invests, right? It's only 6 states were reporting. So it's flawed data or it's incomplete data. I mean, I've deconstructed all the dashboards, again, not to go down a rabbit hole, but what you find is a complete circle in which the management of the data related to the pandemic is in the hands of big tech, and big tech is aligning, as you see from the email from Mark Zuckerberg to Dr. Fauci, right? About, gee, let's invest in vaccines, right? In a complete 360-degree circle. And then you've got Microsoft building and Salesforce building the vaccine passports, right? Or Hewlett Packard in the case of New York State, the Excelsior vaccine passport. And I'm a tech CEO. All that data is more valuable than gold or than oil. And whoever controls all that data is really going to be more powerful than any nation state, more powerful than the UN, more powerful than the WHO, right? So what we see is these kind of circles of embeddedness. And of course, all of this serves China, or China benefits in ways that I don't have to go into, but many distinguished people like Michael Sanger and General Spalding have documented how the CCP has invested in kind of surrounding our influence centers like Hollywood and sports teams and universities with their influence. So that affects messaging. You're seeing more and more messaging that's confusing and disorienting Americans, right? About how America is bad, or American values are bad, or Western values are bad, or freedom is bad, and messages that my people are absorbing with great alacrity in a way that's terrifying. That the individual is nothing. You have to sacrifice your body and your destiny and your future to the collective, and if you don't, you get shunned in this very kind of CCP style, Stalinist style, pre-Nazi style sort of way. So that's the circle. And I just want to give one tiny little new piece of evidence. Shocking, right? This is I invested in like good stocks, right? Like my Amalgamated Bank, it's Right on Bank, and they have this kind of fossil fuel free portfolio. And I thought, well, I want to be a good citizen of the planet. So what we're seeing is social justice being kind of merged into all these corporate missions. And so this says we're not going to invest in companies that provide significant financial support to socially conservative institutions. They lump that in with, we won't invest in animal cruelty, we won't invest in, pollution, we won't invest in child labor. Supporting conservative institutions is one of the things that is leading a big established bank like Amalgamated to move their money, a portfolio like Adasana, which is a all cap global ETF, to shun, to create almost a boycott of conservative ideas. And you see this across the board in institution after institution. So that's my quick roundup. It's an unholy alliance that has bought the Democrats, and it's coming down from the top. And at a state level, I'm in touch with many state legislators because of my work on Dailyclout. And they say, like, we used to be able to work with our Democratic colleagues. They were very reasonable. And now it's almost like they're scared. They can't deviate. And there's vast sums. Like, and the last thing I'll say is people are baffled by the rigidity with which school boards are torturing American children with like masking and, excluding them from sports if they're not vaccinated, even if there's no law in place or no regulation in that state. And millions, in the case of Ichabod Crane, over $2 million is going from legislation that the Biden administration passed to school boards in order, they only get the money if they stick to the COVID protocols. And so there's a destruction of our children, which I think is very intentional, as well as destruction of other institutions, in a way that ultimately is going to serve big tech and serve our adversary, the CCP.
So just to return to that investment notification that you had received. So this was a fund that you wanted to make sure you didn't want to be investing in fossil fuel companies.
Fossil fuels, that's all it's called, fossil fuel free.
And it's saying that it will also not be investing in companies that may be supporting conservative institutions?
Correct.
Wow. Okay.
Provide significant financial support to socially conservative institutions, which is a very broad category. That could be you.
Yeah.
Or that could be my friend Jeffrey Tucker.
We're not conservative, but like, you know, in somebody's estimation, we're not on the left. So
no, but I guess my point is
I
just
could say that we were receiving huge, you know, large corporate donations, but we're not. So
well, I guess what I'm trying to say is this is what the Nazis did, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the medical stuff is what the Nazis did. They flowed all the power and all the money to institutions that aligned with their ideology, and it impoverished and marginalized everyone who didn't. And so what this sort of thing does, and I'm seeing it in legislation, which I read week by week as CEO of Dailyclout, is all this money is flowing to like the Green New Deal. Blew my mind. I thought I wanted to vote for it. It flows billions in different iterations to frontline communities, which are defined as democratic constituencies, basically. And never in America have we said, oh, you're a person of color, we're going to, you know, discriminate in favor of you. That's always been illegal, just like discriminating against people of color has been illegal since 1964, since the Civil Rights Act. So there's this massive kind of, you know, I'm just going to say a plan because I've worked in politics at the highest levels, and this is a game plan to direct, you know, billions and billions from government and the private sector, right, toward the Democratic Party's own constituency. And then the Democratic Party is doing things that serve our adversaries and that serve big tech, who are aligned.
You mentioned Dailyclout. Would love to hear more about what it is and how it can provide people who feel, you know, powerless, who feel that they're frustrated, but they don't know what to do. You have various campaigns, if I understand, for political action, including ones designed to push back against, for example, school closures or lockdowns. So what's your model and how can people get involved?
Thank you so much for asking. So I started Dailyclout, I co-founded it because I saw how people were being excluded from the process of drafting and passing legislation. And I knew the solution had to be digital. So it's a digital platform that lets anyone draft a bill and pass a bill. But we also have this beautiful piece of technology. It's a legislative database called BillCam, which has every state and federal bill. And you can find any state and federal bill. Like if you want to know about vaccine passports, you can do a search and boom, you've got all the, you know, you've got a transparent view of all the vaccine passport legislation, state and federal, but it's also interactive. You can send any of those bill camps, we call them, through social media. And you can tweet the bill sponsor, tweet the rep, you can vote, you know, and show your support or opposition. And this has really moved the dial. It ends legislation in smoke-filled rooms. And it also lets people inform each other very transparently what's in a bill. You know, so many of them are vast and written to confuse people. And this way, you know, we start with an easy to follow blog. Like we're very much like you in explaining complicated things in easy to follow blogs and videos and infographics. Our focus is legislation and democracy. And so we can say, okay, they're saying this healthcare bill covers breast cancer screenings, but on page 60, you see that it doesn't. And then people can send the actual bill through social media and take a look for themselves. It's so empowering. I could mention any number of times this has changed outcomes, but specifically today is very important. We at Dailyclout, because we read the bills, we read the regulations, we notified people that there was a meeting in Washington State in which the health board, the Board of Health, was discussing a regulation that does give boards of health basically police forces and the right to quarantine and detain people if they've been exposed to a contagious disease, right, indefinitely at pending a court order, right? And the person has to behave while they're in detention, and without charge or trial. And so this is such a recipe for catastrophic outcomes in the militarization of Washington State, because whenever societies have these powers, people covet their neighbor's land, or people want to drive their competitors into bankruptcy. And they're like, oh, John was exposed to a contagious disease. You'll have to put him in detention. So we alerted people and we read the regulation, which is boring, but, we've gotten really good at it. And, Washington State was saying, oh, there's misinformation on social media. 1,000%. WAC 100-070, 1,000% gives the Board of Health police powers. And if the police don't go along, it's a crime. And 1,000% it was correct. So we warned people, and there was such an outcry, and I announced it on the War Room. There was such an outcry that Washington State claimed they were backing off and not reviewing that regulation. But this is like eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. We have to do this. So the other thing I'm going to share is that Bill Cam is now launching next week basically a Facebook competitor where you can organize, called campaigns, where you can organize your own campaign, invite people to be part of your campaign. You can embed your bill, if it's legislative, into your campaign, and you can lobby. And you don't need $1 million to be a lobbyist or to be a grassroots political or social movement now.
So we go to just Google Dailyclout, or we'll also put the website in the various comment streams, and get an account and choose a campaign. Is that how it works?
So right now, campaigns launches on the 15th, but right now on Dailyclout, you can, Bill Cam is free. You can just sign up as a subscriber on dailyclout.io and start using Bill Cam. You can find anything on Bill Cam. You can send those bills through social media, and in a week, you should be able to start your own campaign's account. So there's a lot to do already. And I just want to mention one of the most important campaigns we've done in the last 6 months is the 5 Freedoms campaign at the request of our users. And this was we hired a lawyer and we drafted 5 model bills. No mask mandates, no vaccine passports, open schools now, freedom of assembly, and end emergency law. And due to the mobilization of our users and others, grabbing those model bills and our networking with state legislators, and we literally go to New Hampshire, to Michigan, to Oregon to be there at the state legislative session with our little video camera, so they know we're watching, right? 33 states have passed no vaccine mandate legislation, and it was barely a thing when we started warning people about it in April of last year.
So we had mentioned some possible silver linings, and you've talked about how some of these policies set dangerous precedents, which could be used in all kinds of future crises. But are there ways in which the current crisis has brought people together across, partisan lines? I mean, we talked about, unfortunately, that there is a bit of a partisan divide on this, but your perspective on coalition building. I know that this began with your involvement in a group, I think it was in New York, meeting with nuns and other people across the aisle on the abortion issue, and that kind of helped you to maybe think about them differently, maybe not think about the issue differently, but find common ground and craft some kind of positions that you could both agree on. So is that possible for this issue too?
Well, I definitely think there's a massive awakening of some kind going on right now. There's also a massive hypnosis going on at the same time, depending on whom you're talking to. And I do see a big realignment. And I hope that what comes out of it leaves party labels, can't really leave them behind, but keeps them almost in quotation marks. Because, as having been on the inside, those labels just serve to protect both sides who are insiders doling out stuff to their respective, cronies. And they serve to distract people. I mean, one thing I absolutely learned as a political insider is that the hot button issues that we're directed to, like, LGBT, like trans issues, right? Or abortion rights, or, that should there be Santa, in a public setting. These are all, like, they're worth discussing, of course, but they're all really tangential to the bills that we read week after week, which are bipartisan bills quietly going through, in which billions of dollars are being just stolen from the American people, siphoned off by both sides, and handed out to their respective donors or supporters. So I do think we are in for a grassroots awakening that is hopefully nonpartisan, or that wears partisanship very lightly. I hope, but more urgently, I think we are going to have to literally remake some institutions because they're corrupt all the way through. I mean, Gates money and pharma money literally bought the media. When I was deplatformed, it seems like a Twitter spokesperson went to many major news outlets, gave them out of context or false, statements attributed to me, and they all ran it and were not accountable, and they couldn't be accountable because, as the Columbia Journalism Review has shown, each of them has accepted, from the BBC to NPR to The Guardian, millions of dollars in Gates funding for COVID education. So that leads to certain kinds of coverage. They're not free to say the pandemic is over, right? Or Omicron is really not that serious, says the South African Minister of Health. So yes, I do think we're in a time when we are going to have to, after this is torn down from top to bottom and the corruption exposed and the criminals, tried and sent to prison, presumably, we're going to have to remake technology. And that's why I'm really excited about platforms like Getter, platforms like, not Telegram, because they have a fake Naomi Wolf account that they're not doing anything about, but, Gab and Rumble and all of these usurpers to the big three, right? That's so important. But I'm also excited about all of the people writing Substacks, all the people writing blogs, all the people doing making their own media. But lastly, we can't have a renaissance till people understand how important human space is. And what I mean is, we've been encouraged by big tech, and certainly in the lockdowns, to be scared of gathering in human spaces, but also to believe technology is better than what humans can do by themselves. But actually, and I'm speaking as a tech CEO, human capabilities are superior in ways that they don't want you to know. And so what I mean is, when people gather in a room at a dinner party, that is a supersonic way to communicate education that in a way that can't be hacked. Whereas, to my astonishment, state legislatures are meeting on Zoom or Microsoft, completely feeding every single item on the agenda to CCP or to Microsoft, right? When you gather in a town hall, you can inform each other in a much more nuanced and multivalent way than you can in a Zoom town hall, right? Where the moderator can restrict what you're doing. And also, people get hardened, in ways that are almost metaphysical, or that we can't really explain, by being in human spaces, feeling human warmth and creating those friendships. So I really, one thing we're starting on Dailyclout is We're going to have meetups where people can just gather in human spaces and recreate human community, play dates, potlucks, for Lord's sake, and sort of re-privilege the human, because when people assemble, and history shows this, tyrants tremble.
So I'd love, with your permission, Dr. Wolf, to turn to your career as a feminist. You, as I mentioned, have been described as the leading spokeswoman of third wave feminism since the publication of The Beauty Myth, your first book. So for our viewers, what is third wave feminism, and would you embrace that title?
Yeah, sure. I'm proud of having been part of that conversation. Third wave feminism, very briefly, I made up the phrase, and another writer made up the phrase at about the same time. So I guess that just goes to show that sometimes movements that are ready to happen just you need to say it's happening in order for it to happen. But second wave feminism was my mother's generation, which was sort of, Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, the 70s, the great kind of post, feminine mystique uprising of mostly middle class or upper middle class, mostly white women. And that was a weakness of the movement. But it was a very important movement, and it was responsible for, all the great benchmarks, Title IX, Title VII, coeducation, women entering professions, and concepts that are critical, like, you shouldn't rape your wife, or you shouldn't beat your wife, or, consent is good, and reproductive rights, whatever you think about them. So there was this kind of latent or dormant period in the 80s where nothing much was happening, and gender issues were being kind of sidelined. And that happens cyclically. Women are always told that they don't really have any problems, and their problems are not important, and they can stop worrying about it now. But I wrote The Beauty Myth in the early 90s, and I basically was talking about how ideals of beauty, this seems like such a golden age of not that serious a problem, as serious as it was, but that ideals of beauty were restricting women of my generation, and keeping us from being as empowered as we could be, especially with eating disorders, which really was quite serious. So yeah, that's third wave feminism. And it was, I also did a bit of a, annoyed daughter's critique of second wave feminism, because it was kind of joyless at that point and very judgmental. The things that have come back in the left with a vengeance, right? But, very judgmental about sexual choices. You weren't supposed to like fashion. You weren't supposed to, being heterosexual wasn't okay. It was very, it had developed litmus tests, like you have to be pro-choice, you have to be anti-capitalist, you have to be a vegetarian, and really feminism is, this great essential extension of, the great movement for human rights and liberty from the Enlightenment on, from Mary Wollstonecraft on. So I wanted to kind of, shun or get rid of the things that were weighing the movement down or the language down, and kind of open it up, and especially just let women and men say, I'm going to define this for myself. I'm going to live my life to the fullest. Like, maybe I've always been a libertarian, I just never knew it.
Or an objectivist. I think you're more of an objectivist. That's my wager. And speaking of objectivism, so at the Atlas Society, we promote particular kind of brand of objectivism, open objectivism. And the overriding emphasis is on the individual, individual thought, individual choice, individual action. So I was accordingly struck by one line of criticism against your work over the years, which was that, in the words of one critic of the New Republic, your, quote, most dramatic exhortations are appeals to the individual, not society. This particular critic accuses you of waxing positively neoliberal in your contention that the real problem is our lack of choice. In the words of the critic, Milton Friedman could not have said it better himself. Now, to some on the left, of course, that might seem like a terrible slur, that kind of comparison, but in our community, it would, you might wear it as a badge of honor. So what do you make of that criticism of your being not sufficiently collectivist and more individualistic in your work?
Well, first, I want to say I've never been talking about consumer choice, right? That's not my priority. And I do think it's important. I think there's, stupidity on both sides, right? I think it's important for, like, especially in the 80s, there was this really dumb brand of post-feminism, it was called, that kind of predicated itself on the notion that everything, and people, libertarians, I'll argue this with them, right? Like, I argue with my husband because he's more libertarian than I am about these things, that, you can do it all yourself and it's all about individual responsibility. I agree with a lot of that, but I also think that systemic analyses of racism, gender discrimination, anti-Semitism, historical hurdles, right now anti-vaccination discrimination, are really important to just not be dumb about what is possible with individual responsibility and what isn't. That's why I'm always so surprised that libertarians are kind of silent on abortion rights, because I don't like abortion. And I wrote a very heartfelt essay called Our Bodies, Our Souls, about my struggles around the ethics of abortion. But, if you don't see that not being able to control your reproduction means women have no control over their futures, you are just not smart enough, honestly. So, I think my books look at that, always that kind of what is the individual and what kind of collective analysis do we need. That said, we're in a very dire moment in history where I've always been kind of criticizing free markets and capitalism and for their excesses, and shining a light on, great things like Sweden's healthcare system, which is great. But right now, looking at history and where we are, there is more danger to women, to individuals, to children from a collectivist government or a collectivist corporatocracy merging with government, which is the definition of fascism, than from the most rampant individualism and free market you could conceive of. With all of its harms and excesses, that women are safer, when they get to make their individual choices, than when a government decides that they can only keep their job if they're injected with an experimental substance, right?
Well,
women are safer with all the risks and dangers of unfettered capitalism. Human rights protect us. Individualism, post-Enlightenment liberal values, capital L, classical liberal, humanistic, democratic values protect us more than any totalitarian or socialist regime that anyone has ever come up with the best intentions stated in the world.
Well, I think libertarians may be silent on abortion because there are probably some libertarians that are more emphatic on protecting the right of the mother to have agency over her body. And then there are some libertarians on the other side, but objectivists, again, this is why I think you're going to be a future objectivist. And Ayn Rand in particular was anything but silent on reproductive rights. And if anything, her position, very outspoken on reproductive rights and on a woman's right, is that, and her atheism can be a bit of a stumbling block when I'm trying to reach out to conservative students. And so I do sort of a take what you like and leave the rest. But now I just want to return to another one of your most recent book, actually, Outrages, Sex Censorship, and the Criminalization of Love, published in 2019. I understand it grew out of your doctoral thesis on John Addington Simmons. I now know who was Simmons, but maybe if you could just tell our viewers and what sparked your interest in him and your research on the subject.
Thank you. This is actually my favorite of my books, and I hope everyone reads it because this was a great historical figure that history has largely erased. So John Addington Simmons was probably the first LGBTQ rights activist and spokesperson in Britain, or in English, I should say, because he was also admired in America. And he was a mid-19th century upper middle class guy who wanted to spend his life, you know, as a fellow at Oxford and as a poet and as a critic, but his sexuality quickly was turned against him in a highly homophobic time and place, and in a place where, in spite of a lot of attacks and smears and controversy when the book came out, I am right, there was a death penalty for sodomy until 1862 in Britain, and that's just absolutely the case. So he was terrified of what would happen if he lived out his life even in a closeted way in Britain. So he exiled himself to Switzerland. He was tubercular, so that was healthier for him. And he kind of found his great love of his life in Venice. By this time, he was a married man. He had 4 daughters. He was a respected critic, so he lived this completely dual life in which he kept, it's so fascinating for a writer to see what happened to him. He kept all of his homoerotic poetry in a locked box in his study. And at one point, his best friend, who was also gay, what we would call gay, they went to the River Avon and threw away the key, right? But they didn't throw away the documents because these were too precious to him. So his whole life, which was short, right? He died young of tuberculosis. He tried to articulate the beauty of love between men. He's a great romantic. And he tried to articulate, and he did, in these secret manifestos that he wrote, a problem with modern ethics, and it was like forbidden, illegal to pass around. He articulated the first really defense of, the right of homosexuals to live like anyone else, protected by the law instead of persecuted by the law. And the last thing I'll say is that, it's so moving. Walt Whitman, who was he was living in a more free place and time, the United States, didn't have laws of the same kind against sodomy. He found Leaves of Grass as a young man, and that speaks very poetically of same-sex love between men. And so Whitman was like this North Star for him, his whole career, and they had this beautiful epistolary relationship, though of course they never met. And so it's really about this love between Whitman and Simmons. And then finally, the other unbelievable thing about Simmons is that he kept a kind of secret memoir that told the truths about his life in completely frank, modern, stark detail. But he also kept that embargoed, not to be opened until everyone he knew was dead. And he embedded in his memoir,
like the results of the research on the vaccines.
Right, exactly. 75 years. He embedded in that memoir a code that his posthumous editor could put together to tell the story of his great love, which is for this man, Angelo Fusato, a very handsome gondolier. So it's like this beautiful faith that someday the world would catch up with him, and there would be readers that would want to read that story and publishers who would want to publish it. So he's just such an amazing kind of exemplar to me of faith in the future, that you don't know what your activism will do in your own lifetime, but he really brought about the world that we have today in terms of equal rights for people around sexual orientation in many Western countries.
Okay, well, I have other questions for you, as I know I gave you a heads up on some of them, but I'm going to get into big trouble with our audience here since we've got a lot of questions. So let's try to get to a few. We have really just 11 minutes left, but Mark Zenger asks, Dr. Wolf, can you please speak to the role of the security state in America? It's in partnership with the mainstream media, see who become contributors on MSNBC, CNN alone raises serious questions about freedom.
Yeah, I mean, he's right. I think I pretty much summarized my best analysis early in our talk, but it extends to what experts are interviewed on these pharma outlets, MSNBC and CNN, and in the New York Times. My husband, Brian O'Shea, is a very killer researcher and a private detective, and he's found in virtually every case that the mainstream commentators like Dr. Hotez, Leanna Wen, they all are conflicted. If you go back 2 steps, there's money flowing to them, there's talking points. And what's heartbreaking is the talking points are aligned with the talking points of our CDC and, even our government spokespeople like Dr. Fauci and, Dr. Collins before he left. So the doctors that I'm in touch with, who are these kind of very brave, dissident doctors and epidemiologists like the Great Barrington Declaration signatories, but some of those doctors refer to the CDC as regulatory capture, that the institutions that are supposed to protect us are hostage to pharma, and by the same token, the news outlets are hostage to pharma, and hostage to and kind of embedded with the Democrats. This isn't just a Democratic problem, by the way. When Bush was in power, I would go into Fox News and see White House talking points on people's screens. So now you're seeing, White House talking points with different administration on people's screens with different news outlets. So this is why we have to pass laws to clean this up. In, I believe, 2012, the law protecting Americans from being propagandized died. And so the floodgates were open for propagandizing us. When I say we need to rebuild institutions, we also need to have, laws, compelling disclosure of conflicts of interest for people who talk to the media. And certainly laws keeping elected officials from investing in institutions that they're supporting through policy, which used to be the case when I was a White House spouse. I don't really understand what changed. Yeah.
Gabrielle Avintov on Instagram asks, has social media made things better or worse for keeping governments accountable?
That is a great question. On balance, I'd say better, which is why Twitter and YouTube have been so determined to censor people, because it's such an empowering medium. And paradoxically, during the lockdown, people were driven to do exactly what we're doing, and new conversations were had, and people were, hungrily exchanging information. So digital technologies can certainly enslave us and strip us of democratic access. And I've talked about some of the ways, but on balance, social media has let people from all walks of life get educated well by primary sources and ask good questions.
Armin Breyer on Twitter asks, are you surprised with the speed with which the Biden administration has shifted towards authoritarianism?
Well, such a painful question. I am surprised that this administration did that, even though my husband was warning me, they've got ties to China, don't do it. I'm like, I cannot vote for the other guy. And we can talk about why. It's important because I get asked this all the time. People say, you sound like a Republican, which makes me sad. I think I sound like an American, but nothing wrong with Republicans, but I like to think the Constitution has no party. But President Trump spoke about women in a way that I, as a survivor, could not. I just couldn't vote for someone who talked that way about sexual assault. And if we're all looking in the mirror, I say that, I was raped as a child. I've written about it. You can't ask me to vote for someone who trivializes sexual assault. Like, it's not fair. So if he were to, come out with an apology and explain that he's learned, and that would change my view. But I think as a feminist, it's unjust to ask women to vote for people who so disrespect them in public, their essence. And I know people will be mad at me for saying that, but I don't care. I have to say it. That said, now we have a full-on coup. So two terrible choices. And I am not surprised at the speed. If someone is going to break the back of the country as a democracy, because having studied those moments in history over and over, speed is essential. They have to happen super fast, or else they don't work. And shock is part of it. Disorientation is part of it, which is why we're at such an interesting moment, because I think they tried, and some very brave people have been resisting and documenting and reporting so effectively that it's not working as well as they thought it would. And when that happens, you start to see what we're starting to see, which is people backpedaling, people confessing, people getting it out there. Rochelle Walensky, oh yes, people who died had 8 million comorbidities. They were going to die anyway. They want to get ahead of the indictments. It doesn't mean we're out of the woods. It just means that the more we can make it hard for this to happen quickly, the better our chances are of surviving.
Okay, quick question from Scott Schiff asking about the emails between Fauci and Collins criticizing the scientists and calling for a devastating takedown of the Great Barrington decision.
I mean, this is so important to look at. Imagine, these are friends of mine. I like to say that they are friends. They're heroes, and literally the tides of hell are being held back by about 24 brave people, and a lot of other brave people, but in the height of the public spotlight. And these gentlemen and Jeffrey Tucker were way out front before anyone else, bravely risking, and getting huge attack by just stating kind of the obvious epidemiological wisdom, public health wisdom for decades, which was protect the vulnerable and everyone else should go about their lives. And they were right. It turns out they were right, So these emails should be terrifying, because every one of us could imagine emails like that. That Naomi Wolf, we really have to find a way to shut her up. And having worked inside those rooms, the power they have to shut people up or to smear people is already massive, right? So the fact that people sitting at the very pinnacle of the only funding for science in America saying, let's take out these scientists, let's destroy them reputationally, that should terrify all of us, especially because these guys were not enriching themselves or exploiting what they were saying. They were just trying to avoid, millions of deaths, children out of school, mental health problems, alcoholism, other preventable deaths. They were doing their job. So it's absolutely, I don't know what to say. It's criminal, it's corrupt, it's fraud. You're not supposed to use our tax dollars to go after American citizens. It's wrong and evil and probably illegal on so many levels, but it's also a very terrifying, look at how far this administration will go, or these people, I should say, will go, because it's like a shadow government in there with the NIH and NIAID to get rid of their adversaries, reputationally.
So that brings us just about to the top of the hour here, Dr. Wolf. Any other thoughts or topics that we didn't get to, or that you wanted to cover?
No, I guess I should always end on a note of hope. I guess what I should say to everyone is please go outside. I know there are limits, but the more you can resist, again, this comes from history, the more you can say, thank you. But the beautiful thing about most mandates is that they can threaten to fine you, but unless the police officer shows up in court, you're not going to get fined. So from history, the more people just ignore mandates, gather, do what they do in France, have giant picnics in the middle of the street if they won't let you into the restaurants, if you don't want to wear a mask, respect other people's space. But I always say, I have a disability. The ADA covers me. I'm not going to wear a mask. Thank you. I'll stand 12 feet away. I'll go wherever you want me to, but I can't do that. The more you inform each other about how to, and we do this on Dailyclout, how to submit, letters to your employer, demanding an exemption, just not complying. What happens is that it costs money to enforce it on a massive level when people simply don't comply, and it wears out those contracts. It exhausts the funds basically that were allocated toward breaking us as a civil society, and also massive walkouts, massive strikes, peaceful resistance. It worked to bring down the Soviet Union, and it can work to reestablish us as a republic again.
Well, that is a wonderful, practical and optimistic note on which to end. Dr. Wolf, again, thank you very much. I want to remind all of you, please check out Outrageous as well as The End of America. I think this one, well, both of these actually would have quite a libertarian appeal, and an objectivist one as well. So check those out, and look forward to having you all come and join us next week for our current events webinar with our faculty scholars. So thank you, Dr. Wolf.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the audience. I'm so thrilled to go back to Ayn Rand now and read what I missed the first time. I'm excited.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll put together a package for you.